I just got done telling you all about Hitler's greatest mistake in World War II being declaring war on the United States in 1941, a few days after Pearl Harbor. But what if I told you that his second biggest mistake was not invading the Soviet Union? This was not it. Like the declaration of war on the United States, this happened also before Operation Barbarossa in 1942. By almost 2 years, as a matter of fact. Hitler's second biggest mistake actually came to be allowing the Dunkirk evacuation of July 1st of 1940 to even occur. Let me explain. There were several 100,000 Allied troops that were stranded on the north coast of France. The German Wehrmacht, or army, had pushed them all the way back to the coastline. And by all means and by all practicalities of war, that should have been the end of the story. The Wehrmacht should have actually completely annihilated the Allied forces, the French and the British forces, on the beaches on the spot. There were, however, several twists that occurred along the way that allowed them to escape. First of all, is Hitler's stop order around July 27th or June 27th of 1940. So you got all of these hundreds of thousands of troops jammed up against the coastline of northern France, near the settlement of Dunkirk, and the panzers were just advancing ruthlessly, but Hitler mysteriously gave a stop order about 15 miles short. And Hitler's highest generals were thinking, what on earth is going on here? They stopped. The stop was only for 48 hours, by the way. It was not a full stop. But it was 48 hours was long enough for Churchill and the British to get every ship that they possibly could get their hands on and get them across the English Channel, which at that point is only about 21 miles. So it's not a very long trip at all. Which then gave rise to what are called the Little Ships of Dunkirk. Every pleasure cruise, every craft, every fishing vessel that the Royal Navy could possibly get their hands on was used for this evacuation, and the call went out. None of these ships were commandeered, by the way. They were all volunteered to the Royal Navy to use in this massive evacuation of soldiers who were stranded on the northern French coast. And now you're going to be wondering, how many soldiers got away? Here's the answer that's going to blow your mind. 338,000. Every boat possible was used. And as I've mentioned in a previous episode of this, the fishing vessel and the pleasure vessel of one Charles Lightoller was included. Lightoller is the senior most surviving captain from the Titanic in 1912. 28 years prior to the Dunkirk evacuation. And Lightoller volunteered his ship on one condition, and that condition, of course, being he drove the boat. In the return trips back and forth, Lightoller himself saved about 3,000 of these soldiers from the clutches and the looming invasion of Nazi Germany. And you want to know what impact this had down the road? Over 2/3 of these 338,000 soldiers would go on in the spring, or actually the early summer of 1944, to participate in the Normandy landings. So in 1944, over 2/3 of the soldiers would eventually be on ships crossing the channel again. Only this time in the opposite direction. This time they're heading southbound, and this time they're doing the invading. The biggest part of the mistake is that Hitler allowed 338,000 trained, battle-hardened soldiers to escape, and they eventually would come back to literally bite him on the backside. And they participated in the Normandy landing. I'm trying to imagine the Normandy landing minus about 250,000 soldiers. I guarantee the result would have been different. They might have still succeeded, but it would have been a lot harder. And I mean a lot harder. Instead, they wound up overrunning Hitler's western flank. And at that point, the war was lost. Once they got a foothold on the European continent again, there was nothing to stop them from reaching Berlin, and eventually they did in April of 1945, along with the Soviets coming from the other direction. This is his second biggest mistake, is letting these high quality caliber soldiers to escape. And now the next question is, what in his right mind would have possessed him to do this? The reasoning is actually somewhat logical, which for Hitler is unusual. You see, Hitler was a little of a corporal in World War I. And in 1918, he saw German panzers making advances so rapidly and so swiftly that they wound up, the thing that stopped them wound up not being the defenses of the opposing countries, but it wound up being bogged down swamps that sunk his panzer tanks. And he was certainly having flashbacks of this when 1940 came along, because their advance had come so easy and so ruthlessly quick across France that he had this in the back of his mind. Now, his generals who were on the ground at the time knew this was not the case at Dunkirk. Those beaches were not basically swamps or bogs. Those are your more typical land masses. But Hitler, being stationed far away from the actual battle, as he typically was in this war, you never saw Hitler on the front lines, which was much to his detriment. But because of this flashback of what happened in World War I came back to strike him 22 years later in World War II. Thus, it led to his second biggest mistake in the war, which was to allow 338,000 soldiers, battle-hardened, experienced soldiers, 2/3 of whom would come back in 4 years, to land and actually basically put an end to the Third Reich. So that is Hitler's second biggest mistake of World War II that ultimately cost him the war. The first, of course, being declaring war on the United States 1 year later in 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor. A declaration that he was not bound to make, not obligated to make. The Tripartite Pact did not order him to make it. But he made it out of ego and to try to show off to the Japanese. And one thing I failed to mention is that him showing off to the Japanese was actually partially a bid to get the Japanese to invade the Soviet Union, which of course is just to their north. The Japanese had no interest in doing this, so his bid to get them to basically sweetheart them into an invasion failed spectacularly. They had no interest in taking on the Soviet Union, and to be serious, given their numerical advantages at the time, who would? But with that said, that'll get you to the second biggest mistake that Hitler made in World War II, which was to allow the British and the French to escape at Dunkirk, which was presented as a victory to some, But Churchill was pretty poignant on this one. He says, victories are not made in retreats. Old man Winston was actually correct on this one. This was not a victory in the military sense at all. It was a miracle, however. A miracle made possible by Hitler's inaction and downright stupidity. Made based on a partially justified historical fact. But of course, had he listened to his generals on the ground, he would have known that this was not the case. And the stop order would never have happened. And he would have... The other part of this that failed was that he did listen to one of his inner circle, and that being Hermann Goering, the chief of the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force. Goering promised Hitler that if he could place a stop, if the stop was placed on the advancing tanks that were supposed to annihilate these troops, that his Air Force, or Luftwaffe, could do it for him. A promise that failed in spectacular fashion because the Royal Air Force stepped in and came across the channel and provided cover for the stranded troops at Dunkirk long enough to allow them to escape. Did they beat down the Luftwaffe? No, not really. But it was enough. It was enough to hold them off from pulling off a spectacular advance of their own on the stranded troops on the Dunkirk beaches. So that's the mistake within the mistake, was trusting Goering. And from this point forward, from 1940 forward, Goering slowly fell out of favor with the Nazi hierarchy. This is the start of his downfall, the start of him slipping down the hierarchy as his promises were left unfulfilled, and this was the first of many. Goering did not eliminate the Allied troops at Dunkirk as much as he promised he'd be able to do it, which is partially why Hitler ordered the stop of the Panzer units. That was a little bit of a winded story there, but I'm glad I was able to tell it tonight. But enjoy your Monday night, and I will be back tomorrow. I haven't thought of what to do yet, but I'll be back with something as usual. And I hope you enjoyed this rather scintillating story. And again, peace out, homies.